All right, welcome to the first discussion of actual book information. And like I said, to me, I find it all interesting, but to me, I found a lot of students find the first and actually the second chapter too pretty boring. And until we get into the actual, people want to know about fingerprints and DNA and stuff like that. But uh, we have to start with the basics first, like understanding where all this is coming from and what everything means. Okay. So how would you define forensics? Think about that for a second. What do you think this course is about? What is forensic science? Is a DNA fingerprint, is it a DNA fingerprint or a fingerprint? Is that forensic science? What does forensics mean by itself without the word science after it? And understand that it means it does specifically pertain to the law. The forensics is not about knowing. If I said I took somebody's fingerprint, that by itself is not forensics. Forensics is the study and application of science to matters of law. So if I took your fingerprint and analyzed it from a scientific viewpoint in order to prove innocence or guilt or to understand some aspect of the law, then it is forensics. The matters of law is an important aspect that a lot of people don't realize is part of forensics, which is why we're going to learn a lot about law in chapter 1. Okay, it includes lots of things, being timely, accurate, but the word itself derives from the Latin root forensis, and forensis means a public forum. So this is basically in Roman times when they had true democracies where you would go in some areas where you would go to a forum and you would discuss things. That was forensis. It was almost entirely testimony, just discussing discussing legalities in the absence of science necessarily. In fact, everything was more philosophically argued instead of scientifically argued back then. But we now use it for matters of law. Now, what are some major developments? Let's think about scientific aspects applied to law. This has been going on for thousands of years, even though the term forensis is old, but the term forensics is relatively new. But what are some ways that this has been applied throughout the ages? Well, let's go all the way back to 28 BC, which was the earliest reference I could find in the book or the internet, to Vigilis Urbana. And this actually is important to me because Vigilis, it's kind of where we get the word vigil from, or Vigilis comes from the word vigil, but people who were Vigilis Urbana, which meant watchmen of the city, uh, there was this got perverted to Virgil at one time, and you had Virgils, and a Virgil was a watchman. So it was like uh, a shortening of Vigilis Urbana was to call somebody a Virgil, which is where my first name comes from. It means a watchman of the city. So I kind of know this historically for where my name come from. And interestingly, I've also lived in Urbanus. So that's kind of maybe that's why I'm teaching this class. Now we're going to skip ahead to 700 AD. This was the first time a fingerprint was used, but not to prove somebody innocent or guilt. Remember, it just has to be matters of the law. So it had to do with somebody putting their fingerprint into instead of using a ring into into their seal, they used a fingerprint as their seal. And that was used to identify, and they also used it in clay sculptures. So in the sculpture, uh, there's an indication in Shilu's Clarification of Wrongs where a fingerprint left by the artist in a clay sculpture was used to prove that it belonged to that sculpture. So even though it's not like guilt or innocence, it's matters of law. And then there are other things. There are a lot of documents from China, like records of doubtful crime cases by Ho Ning, and even bloody palm prints, not just fingerprints, have been used. I'm just trying to get to ones that I really want you to know. So 1149, King Richard of England introduced the idea of the coroner. Now, the reason I bring this up is we're going to talk about coroners and it might be next chapter, I don't remember exactly when, and medical examiners, and they are not the same thing. And a coroner was originally in 1149 somebody who investigated questionable deaths. Today, technically, a coroner is an elected position. You don't need to be a doctor to be a coroner. You need to be a doctor to be a medical examiner. A medical examiner is somebody who determines the cause of death. That is technically not the purpose of a coroner. Really, the only job of a coroner is you are in charge of the dead body until the rightful people pick it up. It's your job to get this dead body from the crime scene to its family or whoever it belongs to. And if it belongs to nobody, it's a John Doe, and it ends up in a medical lab somewhere, more than likely. Could be done in an anatomy lab. It could have the organs harvested if in fact it is a John Doe. And you have to do all that relatively quickly because you have to embalm a body quickly because it will start to deteriorate and you get all types of possibilities for disease if you don't embalm the bodies pretty quickly. And if you're going to harvest organs, you need to do that very quickly, like immediately. So usually when it's a John Doe, it ends up in like a med lab because it's going to be too late that you recognize that fact before you're able to harvest any organs. But the point is, King Richard of England, 1149. That's how long we've had coroners for 1,000 years, almost 900 years. We're going to talk about entomology later in this course, which is about how insects apply to crime. 1248, they actually solved a murder based upon when flies were attracted to invisible blood residue on the sword of a man. So basically, this man, there was residue of blood on his sword, and there were flies being attracted to it, and that's like, this must be the sword because this is the one the flies are attracted to. Now, it's very circumstantial by today's viewpoint because we'd have to go and prove that there's blood on that sword and do DNA fingerprint analysis of that sword. But back then, that was enough. We're going to talk about blood spatter, and notice it's the word spatter, not splatter. They actually mean different things. We'll come to that more. Fidelis was the first to practice forensic medicine in 1598. So just keep in mind, forensics, 400 years we've had forensic medicine. Which is now more closely linked to the field called pathology. 1667, so this is in the notes. Gabriel Nicolas de Lorraine, he was the head of the first organized police force. So this is what I want you to know. 1667, first organized police force in Paris, France. And this may have been the first uniformed police force ever. Now, so this is an organized police force. Now I'm going to go back because I said, wait, Vigiles Urbana, that's like 1,600 years earlier. The Vigils were, first of all, they were mostly slaves and often had nothing, were either nude or just had a loincloth. So they would patrol the city in loincloths. They didn't have a uniform. They didn't have weapons. It was just their job basically to witness and to be there when somebody commits a crime and to stick up. And they were often slaves of the city. They were owned by the city so that they wouldn't have to show favoritism to anybody. So they weren't uniformed. They were often naked, in fact, and usually slaves. We have the first high-powered microscope, microscopic anatomy. This is an interesting one from 1776 because that's an easy year to remember. And if you see 1776, it would be pretty obvious. Well, Paul Revere, that's a revolutionary name. There's actually a story about Paul Revere using the wooden teeth, the false teeth that were partially wooden of a man named General Joseph Warren. He actually identified the body based upon his teeth. And that's one of the first known identifications of a body based upon teeth, which is now very commonly used. 1784, we're going to talk about ballistics in this course, and you'll see how, and actually like tasers, people don't realize that they're little slivers of paper that come out when a taser is fired, and those papers have serial numbers that indicate the exact taser that was used to fire and when it was loaded. And so let's say you tase somebody and then you run away, you can actually pick up those filings and identify the person based upon all the little pieces of paper that are scattered everywhere. Uh, 1823, more about fingerprints. Interestingly, you're going to see a lot about fingerprints on here, but it wasn't until much later that fingerprints were actually used commonly. So 1829, Sir Robert Peel. The reason you want to know him, first of all, he was the first head of Scotland Yard, famous police force, and his name was Peel, and he had Peelian principles. And these are very important because they're technically still used today, even though you wouldn't know it with all the police brutality and stuff like that. But his belief was the basic mission is for police to prevent crime, not to punish when a crime has occurred, but to prevent it from happening in the first place. Okay? And their ability to perform those duties is completely dependent upon public approval. Look at those first two things. They're like the exact opposite of the way things are today, it seems, to a lot of people, especially minorities, that, okay, they're not here to prevent crime. They're just here to punish us for sometimes things we didn't even do. And they have no approval right now. And that makes it almost impossible for them to do their job. So these are true statements. They need willing cooperation of the public, and the degree of the public's cooperation diminishes proportionally to the amount of physical force. So if the police are using physical force, the public will not follow them. These principles were made 200 years ago, and they're still true today. And this one I find extremely important and where the police need to go now. Police seek and preserve public favor, not by pandering to public opinion, but by constantly demonstrating absolute impartial service. So in order for the police to regain their standing in society, at least in American society, they can't pander to the public, which they're not, but they do need to constantly demonstrate absolutely impartial service, which they're also not necessarily doing yet. So these are the Peelian principles, which police officers are taught this in police academy. So you'd think that it would be applied more. Continue forward. There, sorry, went to there. Now, the first American police force actually started in Boston in 1838. They had day and night shifts. Some sources say Philadelphia had a 24-hour police force in 1833, but I couldn't find direct proof of that. New York started in 1944 or 1844. Chicago, 44, 45. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and there's debate about this too, is why the police forces were initially established. And people will argue that one of the purposes was to enforce Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. And that's entirely possible. But they clearly had other purposes as well. That might have been one purpose of certain groups within the force, but the force itself was designed to prevent crime. Not to punish after crime, but the initial purpose of police forces were to prevent crime from happening in the first place. That's why cops patrol communities. They're supposed to be patrolling communities because the police presence is supposed to prevent crime. 1843 was the first time the word detective was used. It's a very common word now. Then we go back to spectroscopy, which I'll talk about later in the class, photography. The idea of the natural born criminal is a little over 100 years old. And this is because a guy named Cesare Lombroso, I believe he was Italian. I can't remember now. Gosh, why can't I remember where he's from? But anyway, he came up with this idea of biological determinism, and that basically says that you're born good or bad. It's very similar to Calvinism. God has already predestined what you're going to be. I personally believe in people's ability of free will. I believe that there's a combination of both nurture and nature, and that you are not necessarily. I don't believe in biological determinism. I do believe in biological effects. Like they're definitely, your biology definitely does present you with a range of possibilities, but you have to choose within that range. But this idea has been around for a long time, I guess is what it comes down to. And you can believe what you want. Who knows if I'm right or wrong. at least on things like that. 1879, Alphonse Bertillon, or Bertillon. I'm not sure which. I think I've heard it pronounced Bertillon, but it just looks like it should be Bertillon, but I don't know, since it's foreign pronunciations. He developed the first system to identify people using body measurements, and I'm going to tell a specific story about this. Like he used finger length, earlobes, foot size, all kinds of things. And his belief was all of these things taken in conjunction would prove that somebody was or was not who they were. And it turns out that that doesn't necessarily work. Not long after that, 1896, was when Edward Henry developed the first classification system for fingerprint identification. So what I want you to know is I want you to know who Alphonse Bertillon is, because we're going to talk about how his system failed. And I want you to know 1896 was when the first fingerprint classification system. So before that, it'd be just like, oh, those two fingerprints look the same. But now we have an actual classification system. And then we're getting close to the end of the history lesson, and then we'll be done for this lecture. Edmond Locard, another famous person. He's known basically as the French Sherlock Holmes. He came up with this idea called the Locard exchange principle. Whenever two objects come into contact with each other, there is always a transfer of material. You can think about it as there is always something left behind. If you go into crime scene investigation, there's always something there. You just have to find it. And he actually built what is believed to be the world's first forensics laboratory, a laboratory specifically for forensics in Lyon, France in 1910. So 110 years of forensic labs. Now we're getting there almost. I think this is the last one. Yep. We'll talk about mass spectrometry. You should know that 1959, or if you see like a date around there, that's when Watson and Crick came up with the DNA double helix. But we did not. I mean, you should know that from biology. Watson and Crick did the DNA double helix. But if you skip ahead there to 1984, this is within my lifetime. The first DNA test approved in a criminal case was 1984. Now it's like, oh, get the DNA. It's so common now. Go on Maury Povich and prove whether or not you're the father. Since 1984, that's been happening. But before 1984, DNA had never been used in a court. Now it's used, and we'll talk about more of this when we get to DNA. It's technically primarily used to prove innocence, not guilt. I can prove that you are the father, but I can also prove that you were not at a crime. If I find blood at a crime scene and it's not your blood, then it is not your blood. But let's say I find blood in it and it is your blood. Well, for all I know, somebody planted that blood. How can I prove that somebody didn't lie maybe they visited your house earlier in that day and they had some of your hair on their coat and that hair got on the crime scene and that's how I got your DNA. So a positive DNA test does not necessarily mean guilt, but a negative one means innocence. We'll talk more about that later. 911 has been around since 1967, in case you're wondering. And that's about it. This AFIS system we'll talk about more when we get into fingerprints. So that's our history lesson. And I'll review this a little bit before the exam day, because there will be one, maybe two questions on the exam about history. There will be a written exam, but it's like 20 questions, and you'll see it's very laid back atmosphere. I mean, this is an elective, and I want you guys to find this stuff interesting. So don't worry about this, just because we'll go over it again. But if I say 26 BCE, you should know, okay, the only thing that could possibly be is Vigilis Urbana. Or if I say 1776, well, that's got to be Paul Revere, right? Just the timing. You should know Pelian principles, and you should know who Edmond Locard is. You should know 1984 was the first DNA evidence. And you should probably know 1896. Edward Henry's first fingerprint identification. But you won't need to know that. I'll tell you right now, you're not going to need to know that for the first exam because that's going to come back when we talk about fingerprints. So that's it for this topic, the history lesson.